Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday, March 29th. Today happens to be what? Good Friday? I mean, it's always Good Friday when we're on Team Tim, right? And today we have a very special guest, Don. We're kind of going to go around. We'll say hello. I'm Tim Golden, founder of Compliance Scorecard, where we help MSPs operationalize and profit from the compliance piece in your business. Since Mr. Schnurr is in my top corner over there, hey, Tim, say hello.
What's going on, guys? Happy Good Friday. My kids are actually at school today, so it's nice and quiet here. That's just the charter school thing in New York. But Tim Schnurr, Inquisitive IT. I help businesses, small businesses with cybersecurity in the pretty much tri-state area, law firms, accounting firms, and startups.
Go ahead, Jesse.
All right. Yeah, I was going to say, I'll go next. Jesse Miller, founder of Power PSA Consulting. We help MSPs build security programs and scale them and do it profitably. Over to you, Don.
So I'm Dawn Sizer, Third Element. We are South Central Pennsylvania based, headquartered anyway for an MSP. We have 2 satellite offices right now, one in Houston and one in Atlanta. So we help small to medium sized businesses take control of their IT, and we do both managed and co-managed.
Very nice.
Awesome, and thank you so much for that. And so today's topic is, what are we doing to vet into tweak out from vendors? How do we select them? How do we look at, do we have a process in place, or do we just I need a thing, I go to G2, okay, the first one on the list, that whole kind of vendor process piece, right? I know, as y'all know, vendor due diligence is something that I've kind of been grossly involved with for years. But maybe Don, talk a little bit about what do you look at and what does your team look at when it comes to picking a vendor? Where do you start?
Oh gosh, I think it depends on what we're looking for, right? Let's start with that. So I think there's different due diligence that you're going to do depending on the type of vendor that you're looking for, right? So you're going to do a lot more due diligence on a cybersecurity vendor than you would on a marketing vendor, probably. So that said, where do you start? What does that look like? And then things that we look for are our business goals aligned, right? That's one that's important to me, quite frankly. Do we do business similarly? Because if our morals and things like that don't align, it's not going to be a good relationship going forward. So we are a very relationship kind of based thing. And then the next thing is, are they satisfying what we're looking for, and what are their compliance levels, and what does that look like to us? So those are very general ones, but that's kind of where we're at.
I love the idea of the relational aspect, right? We were discussing earlier today about, do the core values kind of align in that relational piece? But Jesse, what are your thoughts, my friend?
Yeah. So, I have so many. Let me try and distill this so I don't talk the whole hour. So I think we have to talk about it from, like Don said, a categorical perspective. Right. So we have to understand, the type of vendor. Is it medium, high, or low criticality to the environment? So that's one piece to think about it. But from a high level, I always use 4 pillars to think about how I'm evaluating a vendor. And the one is, how do we sell it? How do we support it? How do we implement it? And how do we bill for it? And I think you got to think about those 4 tenets as you begin to bring a vendor on board, because from a personal mistake I've made is having the best in breed vendor technology solution and implementing it. And then the first month, a billing nightmare, realizing that it doesn't integrate with any billing systems. And we have to pay an admin to literally stare and compare and update counts in our billing software. So you really have to think about those 4 pillars and start to address those based on some of the lenses I think that Don was talking about.
Awesome, and thanks so much for that. So these 4 pillars, I hadn't thought of that categorically. I've kind of thought of that from time to time. But Tim, what else would you like to add?
Yes, I mean, this is going to sound a lot more consulting or textbook like, but I'm really thinking about it from the requirements perspective. What do I need this tool for? I know we're talking vendors. Some of the vendors are administrative, right? Some of them are more customer facing. Some of them are cybersecurity. Some of them are like an RMM, right? Like customer, has varying levels of exposure to that, but I'm really thinking about my requirements in terms of, like how do I want to go to market? Like, what's my value prop? Specifically, if I'm an MSP, right? Like, am I focused only on IT? Am I focused more so on security? What do I believe? Like, you guys know me, so I'm a big CIS fan. So like, I came into a conversation with Tim talking about CIS vendor mappings, and we'll probably come back to that. So I don't want to spoil that conversation now. But being a very big CIS guy, like, how does the vendor like map or help me out on the most controls or things like that? And then I think I go down that road with like Jesse said, like how do I convey that value prop back to the customer, the small business, right? That's not really going to understand that. So that's like I said, requirements, and then kind of get into this due diligence, which I think we'll dig into a little more. So.
Yeah, I love the conversation about requirements, right? And so, we've had this opportunity when I was at our MSP to like replace a big component of one of the customers' one of the customers' business needs, right? Without getting into all the gory details, right? Even before, like, we had to make a switch from one to the other, and before that, we had to define internally, what did we need it to do? What were the must-haves? The next tool, the next thing had to have. So we kind of built out a little spreadsheet of what are the must-haves, what are the nice-to-haves, what are the non-negotiables, right? Kind of so we knew internally before we started even looking at products, looking at services, and looking at things like, what do we need it to do, right? And even more so, who's in charge, right? Who is the champion in the business that is, and they don't have to necessarily be the one with all the technical details, but they need to have ownership. So as an MSP, when we're working with our customer to either replace a thing or bring in a new thing, AI or anything else for that matter, who's the champion? And what are the minimum requirements for acceptable use piece of whatever it is we're trying to accomplish from the business? So yeah, great point about breast of breed. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
So yeah, I want to circle back to something that Jesse had said, and that was, we want to look at a tool, especially something that we're selling, and how much money are we going to make from it, right? Which is a fantastic thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the other part of that is, are you picking out the best of breed tool that goes along with that, right? Because you may not make the best money on the best solution, but are you actually picking the best solution? And I think that's something it's a hard to swallow pill sometimes, right? Because we may not have the best scenario. And I know we do that with one of our cloud backups, right? It's something that nobody else uses, nobody else has just heard about, that sort of thing. And everybody's like, well, why do you use that? And I'm like, because it picks up absolutely everything in 365, unlike some of the other solutions out there. So I think that's really, really important to take a look at and what that looks like. And like, have you really gone through whatever product that you're selling and make sure that it does work exactly the way that you think it does? Or, are you selling something that's slightly off of where you should be? So I think that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. And one of the other things that I think we should probably talk about too is we all use internal tools that we're not selling. And that's another one that's super important. So I know we've kind of got off on that. Here's all the things that we're selling because that's really exciting. We're making money on those, right? But the internal tools are just as important.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I was going to say, Jesse, I've heard best of breed a couple times now, and we hear this in the space a lot. Jesse or Tim, maybe take a second and define what you think best of breed is. Is that I have a SOC 2, I'm best of breed. I'm, $20 a month versus 10,000. Is that best of breed? Like, maybe talk a little bit about this concept about best of breed.
Well, I think it's a little bit of a misnomer, to be frank, because we're in a spot where the separation in terms of technical efficacy of similar controls is minute. We're talking shavings off of percentage sometimes, or 98 versus 99% catch rate and things like that. So to me, best of breed is maybe not even the term we should be focusing on, but I have a saying that says, the efficacy of the whole is better than the peak of the parts. So you have to weigh not only cost, like we're talking about making money, but we have to think about our tech debt and our ops debt. And so how does that solution play in the rest of our stack? So that speaks to internal tools, that speaks to external. So again, those 4 categories, you don't have to have 100 in each one of those. You just have to understand that if something might be easy to sell but hard to support, there's secondary costs hidden in that, and you want to consider the whole of that product as you go to implement it, right? So I think it's just a way to create a control. And I think that's another important piece too, is this is like the scientific method in a way. When we're evaluating vendors for a tool, we have to have a control. And so the requirements, Tim, that you talked about, and the what does it need to do, Tim Schnur, that you talked about, and then Dawn, how does it actually work for our clients, and what's the efficacy of it, whether internally or externally, and then taking those. And I look at it like I played Tiger Woods in college as a video game, and you're looking at different golfers, and one's got a really long drive or a really good short game. You're looking at that rating and finding the overall best fit for the course that you're playing. And I think that's the way to think about it.
Yeah.
You just had to bring golf into it, didn't you? I made the cameo appearance last week from Hilton Head.
Yeah.
So Eric brings up an interesting conversation. Like, is cost a factor? Can you afford best fit, right? Mm-hmm. And Mr. Tim, maybe talk a little bit about where you think cost might play into all of this.
Yeah. So I'm glad Jesse kind of went down that road, that there's, it's a little bit of a misnomer on what's best in breed, right? So I'll just use an example like vulnerability management, and I'm not going to name any vendors here, but this is just a perfect example where you could pay very little per endpoint and maybe just do scanning and sell. And like, are you going to sell that service as full vulnerability management, or are you just going to sell it as like vulnerability scans or something like we include in our cybersecurity offering, right? So maybe it'll be very little actual tech time, like manual labor, like going and remediating things. Like you're just finding a bunch of vulnerabilities, and you're handing over a 5,000 page document over to the customer. So is that creating value? Are you adding? And that example is just like something like, are you adding something into your stack that you're able to increase your per seat monthly on the customer, right? So when you think about like vulnerability management, like how much value can you resell the tool for? So even though the tool may be $5, $2, whatever, as opposed to pennies on the dollar, if it can actually show value and be cheap for you to deliver, Jesse's realm and operations, right? Like how do you replace and automate and get rid of those man hours to produce that result? So, this is a long way of thinking about it, but I just see a lot of that across, especially in cybersecurity. Like, are they actually, they're not all the same, right? And I think in a lot of these bake-offs, we get into these, how do the tools like compare, right? And Tim, you can jump in here, like in terms of compliance. Like I said, we don't have to really talk about products by their name, but like just the way you're delivering value to the MSP, so they can deliver it and actually sell it to the end customer. Can they actually increase that marginal per seat enough, right? So that's the way I mean. I just there's no two tools are the same.
Right. Without talking too much about ourselves, I want to kind of circle back into like, Dawn, I think you mentioned earlier about like internal tools, right? So we have a CRM. I presume MSPs have a CRM. Like even just that one thing, we're not selling the CRM to our customer, but maybe I'm using, Joe Snuffy's CRM that doesn't have two-factor, that is just out there and then mining all that data of my customers, right? These internal tool conversations, I'm going to kind of put you and Jesse up side by side. So hopefully if I can do this, maybe the two of you. you can do the whole battle royale, right? So let's see if we can do this.
Oh no!
All right, well, that doesn't work.
I've never seen that thing.
All right, so let's just do this, and we'll put the two at the top, and Don and Jesse chat a little bit about the whole internal stuff.
Perfect. So I'm actually going to do something that we just did recently because I think this will make a ton of sense, and this might answer a little bit of what Eric's question was too, which is that, cost is a factor. How do you afford the best fit, right? So we were looking for an internal piece of software, tool, whatever this was, and it's to store our processes, right? So we wanted to write a ton of processes within our organization just so that we had, documented very specific things. We wanted to get all of our policies in one spot so that we can easily push them out to our folks. And we also wanted a way to take our onboarding that we have and put it into a really nice, full featured set of things where we could do internal training for our people, right? That's a big ask. There's not a lot out there that can do all of these things. So we did the whole, let's go see what's out there, go take a look at, 37 different software packages. It was a very painful Saturday, last Saturday, looking at all of these things. And we finally did find something. Again, we don't need to mention exactly which one this is, but we found one that hit on all of these. It is not inexpensive. So how do we afford this, right? So then you start taking into account, you have to know what your numbers are. Like, how long would it actually take you to do a lot of these things? How much internal time is it going to take you to get all this information into the tool? And how much time are you going to save long term just in the cost of, if this makes your onboarding so much better that you're able to retain one employee, what does that cost you? If it's two employees, what does that cost you, right? So you start putting all of these numbers into this matrix, right? And then you're like, okay, well, I'm actually coming out ahead based on this, even though the cost of the tool is a little salty up front. And I'm going to pass it over to Jesse, and he can kind of go from there.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I started my career in carrier service operations. So seeing really large environments and the way that there's a long-term thinking plan for that. I think as MSPs, many of us having bootstrapped our companies, right? We don't think as long-term as that. Like, well, how can I pay for this license with the next deal that I get, right? It's got to be more of a long-term strategy. Like you said, Don, doing those calculations and understanding the long-term payoff and realizing that we're going to have a plan and commit, right? So, going back to the internal versus external, and I think one thing that, in programs that I've built in the past when I was working as a CISO for an MSP, we made the decision early that one of the things we were going to do is hold ourselves to the highest standard of our most regulated client, meaning that we want to be able to answer yes very easily to any client that says, do your vendors provide the same level of security that you require in your environment, which is becoming table stakes for any vendor questionnaire that you get, right? So thinking that through as well. So is this tool, we're going to buy this tool and use it. Okay, does this put us out of compliance with any of our customers' regulations? So that's a very dicey dance that you have to do at that point, and it gets more complicated. But I think with that long-term strategy, you have to start thinking that way because it's going to make you make you more frictionless for your clients as you onboard and go after different target markets.
Exactly. And you're going to hit this little compliance question along the way that says, where's your data?
Yeah.
And then you're going to cry, right? Because it's everywhere. So I think that's a really great way to take a look at it. Yeah, I know. Tim hears that.
Yes. Well, I want to hear from Tim because he's probably dealt with this the most tangibly as a CTO for an MSP that was deep in the CMMC space, right? So, you guys had to really keep a close leash on that kind of stuff with your MSP. So I'd like to hear just some basic advice on that.
Yeah, first let me level set. Not CMMC, 853 or FedRAMP moderate equivalent, blah blah blah, billions of stuff, blah blah blah, 853. So, anyways, whenever we were looking at solutions for the client in that space, we had to take into consideration what that particular tool was or was not doing, right? So when I talked about requirements, we had the project lead. I needed to flip backwards and forwards and be purple today and green tomorrow and all the things that they needed it to do to support the work.
Yeah.
Well, on the cybersecurity, on the risk, on the compliance side, I was looking at the technical things. Where is the data stored? who has access to that data?
Yeah.
How deep does that go down into? Can your, support technicians actually read our stuff? All of that stuff. And, this is kind of the big challenge I see with third-party risk management and vendor due diligence is that, number one, it's the Wild West. There is no standard. There is no thing that says this is what you should be looking for. Right. My vendor due diligence form was over 70 questions long and had nothing to do with the actual product and everything to do with privacy, data, access, sub-processors, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. And 9 times out of 10, I couldn't even get any of the vendors to even remotely think about filling out this form and providing us who can touch it, where is it, how is it stored, is it encrypted, how are you backing it up, how are you dealing with recovery, blah blah, business continuity. So in a regulated industry where our client had these regulations, we're talking multiple $1 million contracts. It wasn't something just willy-nilly. This is real money that supported real humans every day. And if the tool wasn't able to meet those requirements, we could lose the contract. They would have to, lay off 20 people because the contract is gone. And us as the IT people, it's our job to make sure we were meeting those requirements to the best of our ability. Now, not everything will, and we would have to write exceptions. That whole managing the exceptions is a whole nother can of worms. But yeah.
I'd like to hear just from the audience, if you want to throw a comment in, how many of you do have a set of standards or a set of processes that you go through when you evaluate vendors for you or your clients today? Is it complete, processed out, we have everything, we check the boxes and we know what the requirements are, kind of a blend, or no process? So would love to hear from you and questions that you might have about ways to improve that process as we go forward here.
Jesse, I think this bleeds in well to kind of the investment you need to put as a IT provider, as an MSP, into third-party management, but also kind of we didn't really get into the demo and proof of value and understanding. And before I go any further, Jesse, I guess do you do kind of the due diligence before or after your the contract is set and this is going to work, you can sell it to the end customer, which is really hard, right? Because vendors in the MSP space, they've got to take that value prop and then resell it.
Yeah.
Not talking about internal tools right now. I'm talking about whatever it may be, usually on the cybersecurity side. But do you do that third party deep dive? And Tim, you can answer that as well, right? Before you actually know you want to go to market with this, there's the customer's going to buy it and whatnot.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So let me work my way backwards. And, Dawn, feel free to interrupt me and hop in because I know you've got some good process for this as well. So I think, first of all, back to what Don said, having a category. So I always put 3. I put this is a critical vendor, this is an important vendor, and this is a transactional vendor. And you can name that whatever you want, right? Transactional vendor might be a marketing vendor or a recruiter or something like that. We're sending emails back and forth. We're transacting data. There's nothing really private or sensitive about it. We can almost breeze those right on through, right? There's a couple controls. Yeah. Okay. Let's hear it.
Right. So I was talking with a marketing vendor and they're like, oh, well, we put all of our files in this particular location and then you can go get them. And I'm thinking to myself, great. And what are your cybersecurity practices around that? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like,
well,
thanks, but no thanks. So
that's exactly right. And because you might raise them into that important bucket then, right? It depends on what you're transacting. One comes to mind when we were working with a marketing vendor, actually. They're like, our marketing, which we had a bang up marketing team at the MSP I worked at. And they had all these great integrations. And the marketing vendor came in and said, oh, yeah, we just need access just to these 7 records in your database. Well, you need API access to do that. So that takes you into the critical vendor. You got to pass the security controls at that point, right? So
exactly.
Yeah. So
go
Go ahead,
I
Tim.
was going to say we're starting, and obviously Paul this. We're starting to see more and more of these vendor trust centers, right? And so, Tim, you talked about, when do we do that diligence? When do we start that process? And at least for us, it was kind of parallel, right? So as the internal team is defining, I need a purple, blue, black, green, whatever, I'm already starting to do some research on what tools exist, at least to be able to put a list together to say, now we have a bucket to dig into.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, we're starting to see more and more of these trust centers where you can actually go to the vendor and you can see how they're dealing with sub-processors, how they're dealing, like maybe they have SOC, maybe they have ISO, maybe they have this, and so on and so forth, right? And so, start to dig into that, because vendors are starting to realize more frequently, like, third-party risk is real, and it's something that we all have to deal with and we all have to face. So they're starting to put that information. Our friends over at SafeBase, great spot to be able to get that data, right? A lot of people are doing that SafeBase things. You're seeing some of these bigger vendors, even GitHub now, for example.
But Don, do you think you do the diligence before? I don't know. Take an example, like maybe it's firewall, IAM. Think about just some of the things that you've got. Probably a half a dozen options, good multi-tenant options in the MSP space. Would you do a proof of value or like a bake-off between those vendors before you did the due diligence, like the deep due diligence, or
that's a really good question.
Process?
Yeah, I was going to actually hop in and say that, because typically we'll say, okay, we need an XYZ, right? And then it'll go to, okay, these 2 or 3 particular products will meet that criteria for what we're looking at. And then from there, we start down the due diligence route. And then we'll usually narrow that down to 1 or 2, depending on the scenario, just in the due diligence itself. And then it's, well, do we do business with these people or not, right?
Yeah.
And then what does that look like? And the additional questions, and what happens if something happens to them? How does that impact us? What does that look like? I mean, it's really, really interesting in some of the answers that we've gotten over the years on things. So
I think that's spot on. I have nothing to add to that. I think exactly right. You define business requirements first, because that's eventually going to make the day, right? And you start high level, like pie in the sky. What's the optimal outcome with the features this vendor has, and then we whittle down from there, right? So absolutely, couldn't agree more with that.
Oh,
and that kind of goes into
really good question.
That the baseline, you want to talk about what is a critical vendor, right? And that's going to be different by client, right? So Jesse or Tim or either one of you kind of chat a little bit about this.
Well, it depends on like what the data is, right? So I think my definition of critical vendor is like IAM I just talked about. Like there's not a lot of vendors I actually trust, or password management or something like that, right? Or privilege access, right? Like things that are very sensitive and like could blow you up and ruin your day and ruin your business, right? And then there's other things that are, I don't know, a lot less sensitive. So for mine, I'm looking at it from a data perspective. So
yeah, I agree. It's do they have access to be able to affect any part of the CAA triad for critical data, systems, or processes?
Yeah.
That's the high level way I would look at it. But that means you better have a good data inventory list and know what those actually are. So
I might take that a step further and kind of, at least for us, doing a business impact analysis and determining like, all right, Canva for making images, it's probably not proprietary because it's going to be stuff marketing's using. So maybe it has, whatever, versus all of our company confidential on how we're going to market and what we're putting in that pricing. Like, I'm not storing that in Canva. Right? And so like the risk and the business impact around, we're going to put marketing material out, Canva, fine. But we're going to talk about pricing and packaging and sales tactics. And that's not going in one of those systems. That's critical, because that's we've done an analysis and determined that data way more valuable than what does our marketing message or image have to say?
Yeah. It realized to me that I was just getting very esoteric there. So I want to drill down in my answer a little bit and actually be helpful rather than clever. So it's questions I would always ask. sales team comes or marketing team comes with a new piece of software. Does it require any installation on your workstation or browser? Does it have a browser plugin? Okay. Do they need any sort of admin credentials for any system? All right. And from those three, I could say if those are yes, it's probably a critical vendor, right? Because they're going to have some sort of access to critical data. Now, if that's yes, and we can scope it down to maybe an important, then we can get there. But I think anytime you answer yes to any one of those three, you're going to at least be important territory, if not critical.
Yeah, I love the admin. Like, I love the software installation and, of course, admin credentials. Admin credentials is probably a huge go, no-go factor on, installing a piece of software and all of that stuff. Because that's one thing to, like, need credentials to install a piece of software. Like, I don't know, Asana, right? Asana is not making system-wide changes like an RMM or some of those other scripting kind of tools that can work behind the scenes. But this is a really great question too. Like, once you've decided a vendor is critical, what do you ask them? How do you ask them?
Right. I can feel that if no one else wants to jump in.
I can answer this stuff all day long too, but I don't know. Take up the show.
Tim can't talk about his own company, but I'll talk about it, so it's fine. He does have a list, to get you started there. Yeah.
I like to start high level, right? You want to have somebody who's understands your security posture, that's evaluating this stuff, and ask high level questions. I think just a quick line of questioning can help you get a good sense of where they're at without having to send a DDQ through and go through that process. Yes, you're going to want to do that, but things like, okay, well, how do you guys keep your environment secure? Do you have a SOC 2? Is there a SIG Lite maybe that you have that you can supply to us? What security documentation do you have? And what's your general consensus on security? Those are some barometer questions I want to ask and see what answers I get. And you kind of get that spidey sense if they're fumbling and you're like, okay, I don't think they really are doing anything. Hey, there you go. So I don't know, Dawn, go ahead. I know you had some thoughts there.
Yeah, so some of it is, how do you handle our data? Where does it go?
Yeah.
What does that look like? What statement can you give me to prove that, it is where you say that it is? And then test it. Right. And let's find out if that's really true, right? Because we've had that scenario come through where like, oh no, it's only one way, and it's definitely not one way. And I want to jump back to the previous question too with that, is there a baseline that qualifies somebody as a critical vendor, right? If you have to create a rule around any type of scenario, whether it's a document, whether it's a literally anything, whether it's data, whether you're installing whatever, like I look at it from the allow list piece, right? If I have to create an allow list rule for something, that's something that qualifies as a critical vendor, whatever that is, because I'm updating it frequently enough that I have to create a rule around it.
I like that.
Yeah, that's a really great question.
Again, that's a litmus test kind of thing. Like, it's either in or out.
Right. Right.
So one of the things that I tend to, when I was at the MSP, was I would flat out ask the salespeople, like, can I talk to your CIO? Can I talk to your CISO? Can I talk to your CTO? Can I talk to who's in charge of security? And surprisingly, I would actually be able to get on a conversation with whoever is in charge of their security. And then, like, that's a good litmus test, at least for us. Hey, vendor XYZ, who's in charge of security? And can I get them on a half an hour call? And if the answer is a flat out no, that might be a red flag.
Well, it does depend too. Like if you're like, well, Microsoft, I want to talk to Microsoft CISO. They're going to be like, no.
It's fine. They have time for you.
I mean, there is some, like, of course, I'm not going to get Microsoft, but if I'm looking at a new CRM, or in the case of what we were doing specifically with that other customer, is we're replacing a survey, function, a feature of surveys. And so all data, I want to talk to somebody that can tell me and answer my questions about the data, right? And so a salesperson's not going to have that. But if a salesperson isn't going to make the effort to put me in contact, you're probably not in the running.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, so I will say there's a little balance there. Like if they come in and just ask for like your SOC 2 type 2 right off the bat, right? Like before you gain traction, sign a contract. So I think there's a little bit of like, your time is important, that's valuable, like, and giving out your SOC 2 is
No.
a big deal, right? Like,
Well, this is why I advocate for a SOC 3 report that just sits on your website and they can ask for it, and I don't have to even involve that conversation in the sales
well, that would be a little abbreviated because right, you are handing over an attack plan into your vendor. So I don't know.
Well, that's the purpose and scope of a SOC 3 report, right? Is to be able to put that out there, and people don't talk about that enough. They ask, "Are you SOC 2?" And I've had this conversation. Are you SOC 2? Yeah, sign the NDA and I'll show it. Oh, I don't want to look at it.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't want to look at it. I just want to know, do you have it? Well, great, I do have it, but it's only on the management domain and nothing else.
Yeah.
What? So even the SOC 2 stuff is, I don't know, in my opinion, kind of
SOC 2 is SOC 2, right? But a lot of times it's the best thing we have to help us get a temperature for what's going on, somewhat in the organization. So, something occurred to me is that as we're talking through all this, like, I know at least for myself, I can tend to really get dogmatic with some of this. And so I've had to train myself over the years to help enable the business while balancing good enough security. Tim, as we were talking about on our LinkedIn chat today, but
yep.
I would like to hear from the audience. How long does it take you typically to do a vendor selection process? And do you have KPIs or limits around that? So maybe Dawn, I'd love to hear from you kind of what your average vendor onboarding time is.
Depends on, again, it's going to depend on the type, right?
Right.
So let's go with the hard one, right? So if we're replacing. So replacing is always going to be a longer scenario, right? Because it's going to be a planned thing. It might be a stepped thing. So you might be looking at a full quarter, maybe 2, depending on what that looks like. Some of it's going to depend too on you have that relationship with the vendor and they're saying, look, you have a ramp plan with us and it's going to be over this amount of time, right? So you're going to take advantage of that ramp plan and try to get everything done within there. But I mean, usually for us, it can be done either we had like a security awareness group. We were able to rip and replace literally in 5 minutes. So there's that type, and then there's the one that it's going to take you a full quarter into that ramp to do. And I don't know that there's a significant answer one way or the other. It's all going to depend on what you have going for you at any given time and the relationship that you have with the vendor.
I think that's fair. Yeah, and especially implementation could stretch on for a year. I've seen implementations take that long for like an RMM or a PSA, for example, right? But from the selection process, interested to hear from the audience what their kind of thought process is for that. One thing I wanted to bring up too is I like to ask when I'm talking to vendors is about the business. Again, this is to help you with a risk profile and Dawn, you talked about being aligned in terms of culture, but also understanding, is this vendor going to be around for the long term? So how long have they been?
I know you were going here. Yeah.
How long have they been in business, right? You want to, if you can, understand what their revenue is, because that helps you understand your leverage. So again, Microsoft, I don't have much leverage. A startup that's scrappy and I'm one of their biggest potential prospects, I have some leverage, right? To do some negotiating there. So that helps you just, again, frame it in looking at those levels. We're talking about the Tiger Woods golf analogy, right? But then like, what's the ownership model, the corporate structure is, if they're in funding, what's their funding round, right? Like where are they at? Because organizations that are going into like C, it could change drastically the internal culture of the organization, Don. Like you have a scrappy startup that you started working with and they're able to get back to you right away, and they go into like C level, and all of a sudden customer success just got shipped overseas. You're getting replies in the middle of the night and no time else. Like that can change very drastically. So you want to understand that as well, and that could change. And then obviously I like to ask about employees per team. To your piece, Tim, like, okay, yeah, we do a great customer success. We support you. We do this. Okay, what's the pool of employees that do customer success and support it? They might not tell you all those things, but I try to get those answers because you want to understand the company layout, right?
I love that you're bringing that up because, we talk, I'm a vendor. We talk to a lot of prospects and a lot of organizations and a lot of MSPs. And I'm surprised at how many actually don't ask those kinds of questions.
You should.
Now, I will say that we do have a couple of, people that we're working with that we've literally gone back and forth with legal teams on their end and our end to get T's and C's, to get SLAs, to get those things so that we all agree on this is what the thing is, right? Yeah. But the vast majority of them are like click and go, which
good for you.
Well, no, but it kind of like, so we actually now force them to scroll through and do the things, like take time, and you can't just click and go. But, you know, it is surprisingly, being on the other end, how little due diligence MSPs do. And, you know, I want them to ask me those questions because I'm like, I put all this gosh darn effort in doing all this stuff and nobody asks me.
Well, you know, if you're getting asked really deep questions, Saktu, like you're probably dealing with a mature MSP, right? And they're
cuts both ways.
They're putting you in for the long term. And if you're not, they're like, oh, I'm not really sure if this is going to work, and we'll just churn the tool out and whatever.
Yeah,
so
right, that's a great point.
And that's what I was getting by that thing before about like, it's really different. Enterprise sales, right? You're selling to InfoSec and a CISO, and like they're going to use the product and they're going to play with the product. Getting MSPs to understand your product, understand the value prop, sell it, be able to sell it to their end clients is like a very difficult thing. So you just got to keep that, I think, in the equation, right, Tim, in terms of like the due diligence process, like how deep are they interacting with you? I even call it like there's like a little bit of a honeymoon phase, right? Like where they're like, oh, I really like this widget or this product, and then they'll sell it, and then you've got very limited amount of time to prove yourself. So, sorry,
you guys all touched on this a number of times, but it's the external risk to the vendor that you're dealing with, right? Yeah. So I don't think, and again, that easy button that all the MSPs are looking for, and don't get me wrong, I'm looking for it too. So, right, it's a thing. Like, how can I make my life easier? But when we are dealing with a vendor, we have to take into consideration what their external risks are. So it's not just, you know, they have my data and what does that look like and what does that look like for me? But if we go back a couple years and some of the things that have happened, right? What happens if my vendor gets hit? What happens to my clients if my vendor gets? What are the external risks? And it's not just the cyber risks, right? What happens if they get acquired? What happens if they don't get that round of funding? What happens? There's a gazillion other risks that we have to take a really hard look at. And even from the standpoint of, oh, there's this team that we've all worked with for so long and we really like that. Well, what happens if that team is no longer there? It gets shipped overseas or whatever. You hit on that too. So there are so many external risks that we don't think about on that long-term vendor, even vetting the ones that we already have that we need to do too.
Right.
Yeah, I've experienced that with particular vendors. You know, ISPs are the worst, right? Because you get sucked into a 3-year contract with an ISP. You're managing that for your customer. You know, you sign the internet connection for 3 years. You're good to go. You're working with that. You have that relationship, and poof, your account rep is gone. And next week you have another one, and the week after you have another one. And like 6 months in, you're like, I don't even know who my damn account rep is anymore. I can't tell you. And it's not just ISPs. I could say that's true for a lot of different things in the MSP space and tools that we use. Like 1 minute I know who my account rep is, and now 7 iterations later, I don't even know who to I don't even know what phone number to call or what email address to figure out. Right. And that's at least for us as an MSP, that was a huge problem. Like, who do I talk to?
Yeah. You know, it's strangely, we find that that's a huge red flag for us, right? If you get the revolving door of account reps, that's usually the first red flag that things are going south at that particular vendor, or all of a sudden they either, maybe you're not spending enough for them, or what's going on?
Well, it goes to that piece, and like leverage might be a bad word to use, but it goes to that piece of cultural matchup, right? Where you are not just a cog in the wheel, but you're a valued client. And sometimes there is revenue tied to that. Let's just be frank. It is what it is, right? So if you're working with somebody that, you know, you are a valued customer, quote unquote, you're obviously going to get that better support. And at the end of the day, right, vendors are going to get acquired. They're going to churn. Teams are going to get laid off. They're going to get restructured. That's all going to happen. So we have to be able to control what we can control. And that's why I'm such a big proponent for automation and system process for the way we onboard vendors to make sure that we can shrink that window when we do eventually have to shift or, you know, make a change. We're able to do that in the most efficient and quick way possible. So again, you know, control what you can control and do your due diligence, and that's the best you can do, right?
Yeah, there's a couple of big acquirers in the multi-tenant channel, right? So like clearly some of these startups where you had a one personal relationship and all of a sudden they're bought out. So it's like you're saying they have to be mature enough, but not too mature, right? So there's like some kind of happy medium there. Us vendors talk. I'm not a vendor anymore, but talk to each other, right? Tim, there's a little bit of there's a couple places where we
water coolers, so to speak.
So to speak.
Well, you know, here's the thing, right? So, you know, companies get acquired, people change, people churn, all that stuff, right? And so, and as Jesse said, like, how are we as an MSP, you know, adjusting for that change? But I'd take it up, you know, maybe a notch higher, and as a vendor, communicating that through our customer base. Like, yes, we're small enough now, we're scrappy, we're agile, we're the things, right? And so, you know, at some point, I'm not going to be the person as the founder talking to Joe's MSP on how to roll out a policy, right? We're doing that now because, yes, we're young, we're scrappy, we're figuring it out. But at some point, I can't be the one sitting as the CEO, and I hate to even use the word as the CEO, but I can't be the one sitting in these conversations or in these sales things, right? So for us, communicating that across our client base and preparing them for what's coming. Hey, I'm going to hire 17 people and here's the role, but it's not happening tomorrow. And we're going to ease you into that, as opposed to, I just got acquired, everybody's been fired, and now you're talking to Timbuktu in some foreign country. No. Like that communication part from the vendor. So when we're vetting a vendor as an MSP, what is that plan, right? How do you handle that? And how do you handle the communications?
Yeah, I think that's,
So I see we want to talk a little bit about AI and machine learning, and I'm watching my private chat go nuts over here. And I'm like, all right,
and I'm like, no. And Jesse's like, yes.
I'll tell you what. How about if we do it this way? Because I also want to talk about CIS mapping because I love that quite.
We need another hour.
We do. We do. But let's stay with the vendor vetting because I think that's super important. So let's talk about client vendor vetting because we end up doing that a lot as MSPs too, right? Client wants to bring in a new vendor and they're like, what do you think about this particular person or vendor or whatever this is? So let's do that under the lens of AI because I've been asked to do that multiple times, right? So I have a legal client, they want to purchase a product in this particular case that actually has AI in it. So we had that conversation, right? So they're like, is this okay? Is it not okay? What are they doing with our data? And I asked them a couple pointed questions. They went back to the vendor. The vendor wasn't able to answer. I'm like, why don't we just set up a meeting? Let's have this conversation and see what this looks like. Yeah. So in this case, we found out it was actually AI whitewashing. It was really just automation, which that's totally fine. Let's call it what it is. But I think that was super important in understanding where the data was going, how it was being used. Is AI actually parsing the data in some way, shape, or form? Does it stay within the system? Does it not stay within the system? Is it going somewhere else? Where is my data going, right? Yeah. That's super important with AI and especially with the different models that are used. And then I'll get off my soapbox and we can talk about CIS.
So you're so spot on with that. I just want to add on to that. And like you said, understanding how they're leveraging it because AI is becoming ubiquitous. Everybody has AI, right? And some are just more automation than others, but just simple questions like you said: are there data boundaries? Are you running your own internal ML and your own servers, and that's all contained? Hey, that's great. Or are you just APIing to Bard or ChatGPT or wherever else? And what does that look like? Are there guardrails around that? Or is my data literally being flung out into the ether of the AI mind and all my potential IP is training all my competitors that are asking ChatGPT the same questions, right? So I think those are important things that you definitely should update your vendor questionnaires as you start thinking through that, right?
Mhm. Yeah. So, Don, I want to circle back, and I put this comment out here. I want to circle back because you mentioned I'll get on a call with my customer and their potential vendor, right? And so, contracts, MSA, packaging, pricing, all I don't want to get into that, but
Sure.
I know if I like, we would offer as part of our MSP, consulting time to a certain threshold to get on a call to help them pick the vendor. I truly believe that if it's more than 30 minutes, an hour, whatever, that I'm going to bill for that time, right? If I'm working with my customer to help them pick a new tool, some AI thing to deal with all their data, and I'm going to spend more than 20 minutes or an hour on that, I'm going to have a conversation with the customer about billing them. Now that might be outside the norm, but maybe, and I don't want to like have you leak out secret sauce or whatever, but if I'm spending more than a couple of hours in vendor due diligence for my MSP customer, I'm having a conversation with them because that's outside of scope, and I'm billing them for them.
So I think we look at it a little bit differently in that if I'm educating you in some way, shape, or form so that you can make a responsible business decision, right? That's my due diligence and that's my responsibility to do to the client. We are not billing for that. That's 100%. I don't care how long that takes. Like that needs to be a thing so that we can all make a responsible business decision.
Yep.
When I say I don't care how long that takes, there's a point. But
Yeah.
there's realistically there's a point. But again, I think the responsible thing to do is to make sure that the client is making a very good business decision based on actionable information that you can bring to the table, and that it's our due diligence and responsibility to do that as an MSP and as an MSP owner.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
You can look really good there, right? So Jesse, we talk about this, like
you know where I'm going. You
tell
know
them
what
what you're
say.
yeah, tell them what you're not selling them, right?
Yeah.
Like because
Yeah.
MSPs are always selling everything, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I want to do this AI thing, and you're like, well, it's not safe. You're not gonna pay me to implement it because I'm not gonna implement it. So like, like there's a way to like I guess skate the line right there. Like, and the more times you tell them you're not gonna sell them something, you do gain trust. So.
Well, it goes back to ops and technical debt, right? What would you rather do? They ask you a question and you spend a half hour qualifying and structuring that, or they buy some software that makes support for you a nightmare, right? What's the cost of that in the long term? Now, on the other side of that, yes, you do have to get paid. And like you said, it's about the virtuous circle, making sure you're priced appropriately so there's time built in to offer that kind of advice. From my perspective, that's a vCISO job. I'm selling vCISO, a dedicated security consultant to every one of my clients. And whether that's $3,000 a month for a small client or that's 10 grand a month for a 500 person client, right? They're going to have that resource that they don't have to feel bad, and that is actually dedicated for that. And it doesn't. We've accounted for that. We've priced for that. It doesn't hurt our team because someone else that's not their job necessarily is not getting pulled off of it. And like I said, we're getting paid to do it. It's a virtuous circle. Everybody wins. And so we hire better people, we get better customers, and on the cycle goes.
Hooray for that.
So we tend to like in the last 7 to 10 minutes here come down to key takeaways, right? And so we're kind of coming up to that right now. We always like to leave our MSP audience with 1 or 2 key takeaways. Jesse, I see the gears spinning. Shall I go to you first on what is the key takeaway? And since you're up in that top corner and I click the button, you're first.
All right. Key takeaway. 2 filters you want to think about. What's the level of criticality of the vendor? High, medium, low. And then what 4 things do you need to account for in working with that vendor? The 4 pillars of an offer, as I like to call it. What does it take to sell it? What does it take to implement it? What does it take to support it? And what does it take to bill for it?
Awesome. And thank you so much for that. And well, since Don's up in that top corner and I click the button, you go next.
So this isn't something that we got to, but I think this is extremely important too. So CIS maps to pretty much anything. So you can turn on CIS, map it to any other, framework that's out there. We align all of our vendors to CIS so that we're making sure that we check all of boxes off in any way, shape, or form that we need to. And that way it maps out to all of our clients in their GRC. So as you're setting up your vendors, set them up that way so that you have a way to say, yes, we are making sure that we're checking the boxes for all of these things. So I think that's a really good one to put in to that list of things to vet your vendors against. Like, make sure that they can answer, what particular control that they satisfy and the language around that.
That's awesome. I love that. I love the ability to like have a program, have a framework, follow a thing, and make sure you're aligning to it. But Mr. Tim, you're up in the corner next, my friend.
I wanted to get to that. I know we didn't dive too much into CIS mappings, but I mean, I'm already seeing some vendors, cybersecurity vendors, like take a shot at it. It's not going to be the final, but they are making an effort to map to one of the 18 controls or multiple controls in there. So great comment, Don, and applaud you for aligning your offering to that. But my final thought really is like I said, I've learned this being as a salesman, of being a vendor salesman, and it's really difficult. This whole concept of the MSPs in the middle, and you got to get to the end customer. So getting that relationship and nailing that, and feeling comfortable in the value prop on like how you're going to sell the product to the end customer is really important. teamTim, we spoke at IT Nation, and my favorite question is when you walk into a vendor floor is like, tell me one sentence that I can sell to the end customer. Some vendors are going to really struggle with that and squirm, and some are going to be like, oh yeah, we got this nailed. So I think that relationship of quality and customer service and basically making sure that MSP is going to be successful, because at the end of the day, the only way you're going to get paid as a vendor is if they make a lot of money and they give you some of it. So
yeah, awesome. Really good stuff. And so I guess I'm up. We're over here chit-chatting on the private back end in the green room. Before I do, let me just make sure that we haven't missed. Yeah, so yeah, vendor stuff. We've talked about that. Published CIS alignment. That's coming, I think. And there's some great work that Matt Lee and others are doing around this CIS stuff. I know Don, you've been part of it. Tim, we've all been part of this like CIS alignment, and moving it just beyond. Just because marketing says we align to it doesn't really mean we may. Just because I says that it's on the internet, it's got to be true. Well, no. So there's actually some things coming out in the coming weeks or months around, does this vendor actually align to this framework, and somebody other than the vendor saying they can actually align to that framework. So, but let me, I guess I'm just going to kind of go on my little vendor due diligence rant here. So, when we were at our MSP, we always started the process with having a human. When we looked at vendor due diligence, when we looked at bringing in a new tool or a new technology, or even replacing an existing tool or technology, we always started with that human. Who is the champion? Who is the responsible person to make sure we're staying on time, on budget, on track? And they don't necessarily have to be the most technical person, but they have to have enough understanding of whatever it is, the business need that we're trying to solve for. So who is the champion? What is the business need that we are trying to solve for? And thirdly, what are the requirements? What are the must-haves? What are the nice-to-have? What are the non-negotiables? So when we, as an MSP, the three pillars of vendor due diligence was who's responsible, who's in charge, what are the requirements, and what is the business need? And I did that backwards. What is the business need and what is the requirements? Those are the kind of things that we looked at as we started a diligence process around a vendor. And so, Tim, hold on. I think I know what's coming up next week. Let me go look real quick. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, are you talking? You're on mute, Tim. So you just can keep talking away, and I'll talk about what's coming up next week. So,
yeah, it's the Shield guys, Teddy and
nice.
Dylan. So, what can we learn from a pen tester? And normally, I'm not a big fan of pen testers, but I like these two guys.
Oh, Dylan's awesome.
Yeah. So next week, same bat time, same bat channel. You can find us here on LinkedIn, YouTube, all the socials. 2:00, Shield Cyber. We're going to throw the word pen test out there. but really great people, really interesting conversation around, easily things that can be easily exploitable. And so, hey, peace out, everybody. Good Friday, happy Easter, all the things. Do the like and the subscribe thing. I don't know, I'm supposed to say that crap. But anyways, have a great week, everybody.
Subscribe now.